All right, we are reading Corrie tenBoom, Keeper of the Angel's Den by Janet and Geoff Benge. We are finally on chapter 15, titled Help, Hope, and Healing. Even though the war was over, things did not return to normal in Holland. The whole Dutch way of life had been damaged. Almost every family in the country was missing a son or a nephew. And for the tenBoom family, their nightmare did not immediately end with the war. In 1946, Willem tenBoom died, having never fully recovered from the tuberculosis he contracted while imprisoned by the Nazis. He died without knowing what had happened to his oldest son, Kik. It wasn't until several years later that Tina finally learned that their son had died in the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp in Germany. Slowly, information began to come out about how brutal and terrible Adolf Hitler and the Nazis had really been. It was worse than anyone had imagined. Of the 115,000 Jews in Holland before the war, only about 8,500 survived. And throughout Europe, between 18 million and 26 million people had died in concentration camps. It was hard to get in an exact number because so many people had just disappeared with no trace. But two numbers that were known were that at least 6 million Jews and 400,000 gypsies had been killed. Some of the pictures photographers took of what the Allies found when they entered the concentration camps were so horrible that they were never published. When all the soldiers killed were added in, the Second World War claimed over 50 million lives and destroyed some of the world's most beautiful cities. Before he died, Willem was able to locate the unmarked grave in Scheveningen, where Caspar tenBoom had been buried. The tenBoom family had his body reburied in the war cemetery at Loenen, along with hundreds of other brave men and women who, working for the underground, had given their lives for their fellow countrymen. The grand old man of Haarlem finally had his resting place he deserved. Corrie wept during the dedication service of his new grave. She mourned that Betsy's body would never lie beside his. Corrie stayed busy speaking after the war. More than ever, people needed to hear about how to forgive others and how to go on with their lives. She was especially concerned for the people who, like her, had been held captive by the Nazis and had witnessed unspeakable horrors. Many of them had been so terrified by what they saw and experienced that they found it hard to fit into normal life. During this time, there was one particular meeting Corrie spoke at that she never forgot. It was like many of the other meetings until the end, when a well-dressed woman came up to her. "Hello," said the woman. "I am Mrs. Behrens de Haan, and I live in Bloemendaal." Corrie nodded. She knew the area well. Years before, she had regularly taken her walking club for strolls around the gardens of the palatial homes there. "Do you still live in that little house with the clock shop downstairs?" asked Mrs. de Haan kindly. Corrie frowned, wondering whether she should know this woman. "Yes, I do," she replied. "How do you know about it?" Mrs. de Haan smiled. "My mother used to tell me stories about her visits there. She would go to visit a woman who had been married to a pastor." Corrie smiled. "Tante Jans, she was always involving ladies in charity work." Mrs. de Haan nodded. "Yes, my mother was very interested in charity, and so am I. When you were speaking about the need for a place for those released from the Nazi prisons and concentration camps to go to recuperate, I had the strangest impression that I should talk to you. My husband is dead, but we had 5 sons together. All 5 of them worked in the underground, and one of them, Jan, was captured and taken off to Germany. We have not heard a word from him since." "Do you want me to pray for him, Mrs. de Haan?" "I would be honored to do that," said Corrie, trying to anticipate where Mrs. de Haan was headed with the conversation. "No, that's not it," she said with a smile. "When I was listening to you, I felt God tell me 2 things. First, Jan would be fine and coming home soon. And second, when he comes home, I should hand my home over to you for your work as a way of saying thank you." For a moment, Corrie didn't know what to say. It sounded like Mrs. DeHaan thought she had made some sort of bargain with God to get her son back. Corrie did not want to be a part of that. What if her son didn't come home? Not many underground workers who were captured did. Quickly, she tried to think of some way to let Mrs. DeHaan down gently. "That's very kind of you," Corrie began, "but back in Ravensbrück, shortly before she died, Betsy described to me the inside of a home. She was very specific about the details, and I believe in her memory I should do my best to find a home like the one she described." Corrie paused to recall Betsy's description. The house she described had inlaid wood floors, and there were marble statues set in little nooks all along the walls, and the staircase was wide, and the windows were tall and went all the way to the ceiling. Corrie stopped mid-sentence when she saw the beaming smile that had spread across Mrs. DeHaan's face. "Then that settles it," said Mrs. DeHaan. "I see you've been to my house already. I can't wait for Jan to get home." Just a second. Oh my goodness. Corrie was amazed by her reply, but not nearly as amazed as when Mrs. DeHaan's son, Jan, returned home alive and well a few days later. And nothing compared to how amazed she was when later that week she toured the DeHaan home. It was exactly like the house Betsy had described to her in Ravensbrück. Corrie had thought that in her delirious mind Betsy may have been describing what she thought heaven was like. But in fact, she had been describing the inside of Mrs. DeHaan's home. It gave Corrie goosebumps to walk across the inlaid wood floor and stare up at the statues set into the nooks in the walls. It was a beautiful place, a perfect place for people to rest and get over the trauma of being held captive in a concentration camp. True to her word, Mrs. DeHaan handed over the 56-room home to Corrie. Within a month, the house was filled with people. Some of them were newly released from concentration camps. Some were Jews who had spent the past 5 years hiding in attics and cellars. Others were Dutch people who had been bombed out of their homes and had nowhere else to go. Still others were orphans whose entire families had been wiped out by the Nazis. Many people came to help Corrie with her work. Doctors and nurses, gardeners and housekeepers all came to lend a hand. But many who came to help thought that Corrie should run the home more strictly. For example, at 3 o'clock every morning, one man got up and walked to Haarlem. He had spent a good part of the war in a concentration camp, and Corrie knew he needed to know he was free to go anywhere at any time. Some people thought the gate should be locked at night so he could not go out. Corrie, though, refused to lock anything. She had seen enough locks and barbed wire to last a lifetime, and so had many of the people who came to her for help at the DeHaan house. Meals, too, were served any time anyone wanted something to eat. Again, some nurses suggested that Corrie have bells and proper meal times. But Corrie could not do it. The lives of the people she was helping had been entirely regulated by horns and bells for so long that they, like her, never wanted to hear either again. Corrie remembered how wonderful it had been when she got to the hospital at Groningen. She remembered the smell of the fresh sheets, the kindness of the nurses, the Bach music playing on the radio, and the shelves stocked with books. Kindness and beauty, they were the things the survivors needed most of all, and Corrie did all she could to provide them for the people who came to her for help. Many people found healing and peace at the DeHaan home, but one group of people could find no peace anywhere in Holland. It seemed no one wanted to help them. They were the men and women who had been a part of the National Socialist Bond, the NSB, which had helped the Nazis control Holland. As soon as the war was over, their neighbors turned on them, showing all the anger and hatred they had not been allowed to express for 5 years. The members of the NSB were thrown out of their homes and spat upon when they went out in public. Corrie felt sorry for them and invited several to live in the De Haan house in Bloemendaal. This turned out to be a disaster. The people who had lost family members and friends because members of the NSB had betrayed them would not welcome them into the house. There were huge arguments, and in the end, Corrie had to give up the idea of forcing them to live together. Corrie came up with another idea, however. She remembered the night her father had been arrested and his words to the Nazi official who had offered him his freedom. "Tomorrow morning I will open my doors again to anyone who is in need of my help," he had said to the officer. Casper tenBoom would have let members of the NSB into his home. Corrie was sure of it. So in honor of him, she allowed those who had been in the National Socialist Bond to take over the Benge and live in it. 6 or 7 of them at a time went to live in the house of a man whom a member of the group had betrayed. There they found help and healing. Gradually, the people at Bloemendaal followed Corrie's example and began to reach out to their fellow countrymen and women living at the Benge. But as she was urging people to forgive others, especially those who had been members of the NSB, Corrie was wrestling with her own thoughts and feelings. An old friend from the underground had told her where Jan Vogel was living. Jan Vogel was the man who had visited her the night before the raid, asking for 600 guilders. Corrie knew she had to forgive him. Finally, one day, she felt strong enough to get out a pen and paper and began writing him a letter. "I heard that you are most likely the person who betrayed my family and me. As a result, I was in a concentration camp for 10 months. My father died in prison 9 days after he was arrested. My sister died in Ravensbrück concentration camp." Corrie struggled to write the letter. "God, I do not have the strength to forgive this man. Please give me your strength," she prayed as she wrote. Eventually, she finished the letter, telling Jan Vogel she forgave him for the terrible thing he had done to the tenBoom family, and urging him to ask God to forgive him also. By 1947, so many people wanted to help with the work at the De Haan house in Bloemendaal that Corrie had time to write and travel. It was during this time she wrote her first book, A Prisoner and Yet. Most of the book was written in the early hours of the morning. 2 years after being released from Ravensbrück, Corrie still awoke at 4:30 every morning, the time the prisoners had gotten up for roll call. The book told the story of Corrie and Betsy's time at Vught and Ravensbrück. The message of the book was that God wants all persons to forgive those who have wronged them. After writing the difficult letter to Jan Vogel forgiving him, Corrie thought she was living the message of her book. That is, until she traveled to Germany to speak. At a large church in Munich, she spoke about how God asks people to forgive one another and how, with his love, they can become like brothers and sisters, no matter their nationality. When Corrie had finished speaking, many people came up to thank her for what she had said. She shook their hands and thanked them for coming and listening. Then, when the church was nearly empty, Corrie spotted a tall man with blonde hair making his way towards her. In a flash, she was back in the shower building at Ravensbrück. This man, an SS guard, was standing by the door, hand on his gun, leering at the women prisoners as he made them strip. Corrie stood motionless as he approached her. She heard his voice as if it were a million miles away. "Thank you for your talk," he said. "It is so wonderful to know God forgives all of our sins, isn't it?" Corrie looked at the man standing in front of her. Instead of seeing his smiling face, she saw the faces of Betsy and her father. The man thrust out his hand to shake Corrie's, and as he did so, hatred filled her heart. She would not and could not lift her hand to shake his. "Oh God," she prayed silently, "help me to live my message." As she prayed those words, it was as though a strong jolt of electricity had run through her body. Her arms stretched out as though she had no control over it, and she shook the man's hand. As she did so, all the hatred she felt melted away, and she knew she had forgiven him. Yes, it is wonderful to know that God forgives all our sins, she said, meaning every word. Later, in Germany, another man came to see Corrie. He had heard about her work at the De Haan House in Bloemendaal. He was a member of the German Lutheran Church, and he told Corrie that the new German government wanted the church to open a similar home for Germans who had been devastated by the war and were still struggling to adapt to normal life. He asked Corrie if she would help set it up. Corrie thought it was a good idea until she heard where it was going to be located, in a former concentration camp called Darmstadt. She didn't think she had the strength to go inside another concentration camp, even though it had been closed for 2 years, much less turn it into a place of recovery. However, Betsy's words rang in her mind. We must tell them there is no pit so deep that God's love isn't deeper. Despite her feelings, Corrie knew what she had to do, and she set about turning Darmstadt into a place of hope and healing. The years sped by for Corrie. In 1953, Noli died, leaving Corrie feeling very alone. Corrie was the last of Caspar tenBoom's children still alive, but she did not give up her work. More opportunities came for her to speak and share her simple message. All in all, she visited over 60 countries, including Cuba, Taiwan, Israel, and New Zealand. In 1956, she went on one of her speaking trips with Dr. Bob Pierce, founder of World Vision. They had just finished a series of meetings in Taiwan when he made a ridiculous suggestion. Why don't you meet with Queen Wilhelmina of the Netherlands? Corrie laughed. She decided that since Bob Pierce was an American, he didn't understand that a Dutch commoner did not make an appointment to see the Queen. It's not that easy, she told him. Well, replied Bob Pierce, pray about it and see what happens. Corrie agreed to do that, but she knew she had nothing extraordinary in Holland. Many thousands of Dutch people had been as brave as she had been, and some had suffered far more than she had suffered. Still, she would pray about it. When Corrie got back to the Netherlands, she sent a letter to Wilhelmina, who now called herself Princess Wilhelmina because she had stepped aside from the throne so that her daughter Juliana could become queen. 3 days later, the royal car was outside Corrie's house waiting to pick Corrie up. Corrie sat in shock all the way to Toulouse, where the royal palace was located. Corrie and Princess Wilhelmina became good friends, and the princess invited Corrie back for many evening chats. Corrie told her all about her life and how God had given her a message of forgiveness to take to the world. She also told Princess Wilhelmina about her father and how he had prayed for her every morning of his life, and how he would have loved to know that his youngest daughter actually sat in the palace and talked with Wilhelmina about God's love. As Corrie got older, she found it more difficult to travel alone, so she was joined by an assistant, Connie van Hoogstraten. Together they continued traveling the world, where Corrie would share her message with anyone who would listen. On one of her trips to the United States, Corrie met a talented writing duo, John and Elizabeth Sherrill, who listened to her story and read her book, A Prisoner and Yet. The Sherrills asked Corrie if they could work with her on a book that would tell the whole story of the tenBoom family during the German occupation of Holland. Corrie agreed, and in 1979, The Hiding Place was published. What? Just like this one. The book was an instant hit, selling over 2 million copies. Suddenly, Corrie tenBoom was a well-known figure to Christians around the world. Although she found it difficult being famous, she was grateful that the fame helped to spread her message even farther afield. Wherever she went, she took a box of her books to give away to people, all sorts of people. At an airport, she would start a conversation with a skycap. I bet you really know your way through the airport, she would comment. Skycap would agree. proud that someone had noticed. Well, that is wonderful, Corrie would go on, but it is more important that you know the way to heaven. Do you? Then she would pull out one of her books, sign it, and hand it to the sky cap with great flourish. Here, read this, and if you have any questions, write to me. She would tuck an address card into the book. When she had settled into her seat on the airplane, she would stop a stewardess. Would you please give this to the pilot? She would ask as she handed the stewardess 2 copies of her book, one for her to keep and one for the pilot. From the time The Hiding Place was published, Corrie was hardly ever back in Holland. She slept in a different bed almost every night as she busily kept up her travel schedule. However, in 1974, she got to return to Haarlem. The Hiding Place was being turned into a movie, which was filming in Holland. Corrie took the cast and crew of the movie to visit the Benge. She led them along Barteldordestraat and up to the familiar green door of the Benge. She opened the door and stepped back in time. The Benge was still filled with memories of her mother and father and Betsy. As she ushered the cast and crew inside, she stopped in her tracks. There was a noise coming from upstairs. She motioned for the others to stay put downstairs while she climbed the stairs to investigate. The noise grew louder and louder as she climbed. It was coming from her old bedroom on the 3rd floor, and it was the sound of Hebrew chanting. Loud, sorrowful chanting. Corrie knew the voice could belong to only one person, Jussi. She tiptoed to the door of her old bedroom and peeked in. There, side by side, stood Jussi and Hans Polly. Jussi was chanting and Hans was listening with his eyes closed. When they had finished, Corrie walked into the room. All 3 of them embraced warmly. What are you doing here? She finally asked. It has been 30 years since we were hiding here, said Jussi, waving his hand towards the angel's den. When we sat in there, hour after hour, wondering whether we would be caught by the Nazis, I made a promise to God. I told him that if I got out alive, I would come back to this place to sing praises to him in my loudest voice. Not only did I make it through, but my wife and 3 children also survived the war intact. His voice cracked, and then he went on. Today, I came back to sing. Corrie smiled. Her father would have loved to hear the Jewish cantor's voice resounding through the Benge once more. Finally, the 3 of them descended the stairs in the clock shop. The cast and crew were waiting eagerly for a report on the noise upstairs. Corrie introduced Jussi and Hans to the cast, who peppered them both with questions about their experiences hiding out in the Benge during the war. Corrie continued to travel the globe, sharing her message of love and forgiveness. Occasionally she would feel it was time for her to settle down and lead a quiet life, but then she would remember Betsy's words. We must tell them there is no pit so deep that God's love is not deeper. Whenever Corrie heard those words ring in her mind, she knew she had to keep going. In 1976, at the age of 84, Corrie was still going strong. She and her assistant embarked on an 18-city tour of the United States that took 7 months. Eventually, though, Billy Graham, who had befriended Corrie, convinced her she should settle down a little and stop her hectic pace, which would wear a woman half her age out. So in 1977, Corrie and her new assistant, Pam Rosewell, moved into a ranch-style house in the suburb of Placentia, located in Orange County, California. Corrie might have agreed to stay put in one place, but she hadn't said anything about stopping. She announced to Pam her latest plan. She would produce 5 new books and 5 new teaching movies in less than 2 years. By her 87th birthday, Corrie had completed her plan, but the effort and energy required to do it had taken its toll on her body. One morning, soon afterwards, Corrie awoke to find she could not move at all. Lying in bed, she knew what had happened. She had suffered a massive stroke, just as her mother had 60 years before. At first, everyone thought Corrie was going to die, but she didn't. She recovered a little, but she could no longer speak. Then she had a second and a third stroke. Her old Dutch friend Lottie Reimeringer moved into the house to help Pam Rosewell take care of her. They played the music of Bach and Beethoven on the stereo and took turns reading to Corrie. They even read some of her own books to her. As they read, Corrie relived her happy childhood with Betsy, Willem, and Nolly. She could hear Peter's wonderful organ music and see her mother doing embroidery. She remembered her father sitting in his favorite chair and experienced again the joy of running through the sand dunes with her Triangle Club girls. And she would smile and nod, wonder what a wonderful life she had lived. Her experiences had made her famous, and her books and movies would have made her rich if she hadn't given nearly all of her money away to various causes. Corrie had faithfully followed the encouragement Betsy had given her 33 years before. She had spent the rest of her life being released from Ravensbrück. She had spent the rest of her life after being released from Ravensbrück telling people there was no pit so deep that God's love wasn't deeper. Finally, the woman who had lived to tell others about love and forgiveness died quietly in her bed on April 15th, 1983, on her 91st birthday. Corrie tenBoom was buried in Los Angeles, and her gravestone was inscribed, Corrie tenBoom, 1892 to 1983. Jesus is Victor. The end.